Hi, everyone, and welcome to the California Coastal Resilience Network webinar series. My name is Jen Fields, and I'm the facilitator for the Coastal Resilience Network, as well as the Climate Ready Sea Grant State Fellow at the State Coastal Conservancy. The California Coastal Resilience Network promotes knowledge exchange through webinars on climate-induced impacts on human communities and coastal habitats. We will provide a link to the network if you would like to join or watch past webinars, including today's, in the follow-up email you'll receive after today's webinar. Today's presentation will provide an overview for the Marshes on the Margin project. The Marshes on the Margin project set out to investigate how the dynamic estuarine systems of Southern California will be affected physically and biologically by sea level rise, and to determine how and where nature-based solutions can be used to provide resilience to those efforts. Our panelists will include some key coastal managers and researchers on this project. We will start this webinar with a project overview from Evan Sloan from the State Coastal Conservancy. Jeremy Lowe from the San Francisco Estuary Institute will discuss work within transition zones and the Marsh Adaptation Planning Tool update. Dane Behrens from the Environmental Science Associates will review the results from the quantified conceptual modeling. Dr. Lee Erickson from the U.S. Geological Survey and Dr. Maya Hayden from Point Blue Conservation Science will cover Cosmos and our CoStar future. And Dr. Kevin Buffington and Dr. Karen Thorne, also from USGS, will present the Marsh evolution results. To go into webinar logistics, we will listen and watch the panelist presentation in the order of the agenda on the screen for about 45 minutes and follow with a Q&A session. During the presentation, please feel free to submit questions using the Q&A box on the bottom right-hand side of the Zoom screen. We also have closed captioning available during the webinar that you can enable using the closed captioning function. I will collect, review, and read the questions, and the Marshes on the Margin team will respond. This webinar will be recorded and available for review after the webinar. And with that, I will happily pass the virtual mic off to Evan Sloan.
I'm back. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, so can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay, I got completely frozen there. So let's try again. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Oh my gosh. Okay, I thought I was gonna have to force quit my whole computer. Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Evan Borgness Sloan with the Coastal Conservancy and the previous manager of the Southern California Wetlands Recovery Project. Thanks for joining the webinar. Today, we will be sharing our process and results for the Marshes on the Margins project. This project aimed to analyze vulnerabilities for intermittently open estuaries across Southern California and develop nature-based adaptation solutions to provide these estuaries with sea level rise resilience. This project was key in helping the Wetlands Recovery Project set its quantitative wetland restoration objectives as a part of its 2018 regional strategy. So taking a step back, you may know that there are approximately 104 estuaries from Point Conception to the Mexico border. With this complexity, due to the range and sheer number of wetland systems, the Wetlands Recovery Project, or WRP, was created to coordinate restoration activities and target resources to turn piecemeal restoration efforts into a visionary and long-term regional approach. In order to successfully guide those decisions, the WRP needed the most up-to-date science, especially in terms of climate change on these wetland systems. To that end, the WRP needed to update its regional strategy, the guidance document used to coordinate wetland restoration throughout Southern California. This update included wetland science on historical ecology, current stressors, and climate change that had emerged over the past decade. This project was a collaborative effort with government agencies, scientists, and stakeholders all at the table. During this process, the collaborative group conducting the scientific analyses for the regional strategy update identified 2 key data gaps needed to complete the restoration objectives. Those data gaps included how intermittently open estuaries will function when faced with rising sea levels, and where and how managers should restore transition zones needed for future marsh migration. Intermittently open estuaries are naturally dynamic systems that open and close to the tides on a seasonal and sometimes annual basis. They tend to close in the dry season, sometimes allowing salt flats to emerge when the water evaporates, and also sometimes filling and ponding when the rains return. If watershed inputs from storm events are strong enough, the inlet then can reopen to the tides. However, most intermittently open estuaries don't function with those natural changing states in Southern California anymore due to human interference. Further complicating the issue, it is unknown how climate change will affect these systems because all existing sea level rise models at the time could not predict effects when an estuary inlet was closed. Additionally, transition zones are the areas where tidal wetlands transition into upland habitat. Preserving, restoring, and protecting the upland areas currently surrounding Southern California's wetlands in the region is the best chance of having wetlands survive future sea levels. While the scientists identified transition zones as a priority for wetland persistence early on, it was unknown where those transition zones exist today, where they could exist if certain types of infrastructure were removed, and how they should be restored. So to understand how intermittently open estuaries function and to identify where and how transition zone restoration should occur, the WRP applied to NOAA's Ecological Effects of Sea Level Rise grant program with 7 partners. Today, the project partners will share their tasks and products, but at a high level, I'll provide an overview. So UC Davis and ESA analyzed how intermittently open estuaries will function in the future. USGS conducted sea level rise and marsh migration modeling in these estuaries. The Southern California Coastal Water Research Project helped translate the results into the regional strategy update. Point Blue integrated products into the existing Our Coast, Our Future tool. The San Francisco Estuary mapped transition zones and developed management guidance. And the Tijuana River, NER, and USC Sea Grant helped organize and hosted stakeholder workshops. The final results and information for the regional strategy update, as well as some of the more specific Marsh on the Margins products, can be found at these 3 websites, the WRP's website, the WRP's online database basin tool, and Our Coast, Our Future. And I believe Jen will be sending these out to the participants after the webinar. And with that, I will hand it over to our next speaker.
Well, thank you, Evan, and happy birthday. Good morning, everybody. My name is Jeremy Lowe. I'm a geomorphologist with the San Francisco Ice Institute. Hope everybody can see my slide. I'm here to talk about SFEI's work on task 2 of the Marshes on the Margins project, funded by NOAA, which focused on wetland upland transition zones in Southern California. And we are very grateful for the valuable input and oversight from both the Southern California Wetland Recovery Program's Science Advisory Panel and their Wetlands Management Group. The wetland upland transition zone lies between the tidal wetlands and adjacent upland habitats. They are characterized by gradients of topography, salinity, and soil moisture. These gradients provide unique habitats like alkali wetlands and salt pans. They are significant hydraulic and sediment inputs across this zone into the wetlands. They also provide habitat and flood refuge for marsh wildlife, foraging access for upland wildlife, and migratory corridors. In the future, transition zones could provide important migration space to allow tidal wetland species and habitats to persist as sea levels rise. Southern California's historical ecology had extensive areas of gradual transition zones with complex hydrology and salinity patterns, such as this description of the North San Diego lagoons. However, much of California's historical transition zone habitat has been lost as the drier areas adjacent to the wetlands have been developed for human uses, diminishing the natural transition zone's benefits. Sea level rise will increase the challenge of protecting and expanding transition zone habitats as it is squeezed between rising water levels and developed areas. The Southern California Regional Strategy of 2018 marked a significant shift in the approach to wetland recovery from focusing on areas that are wetlands to expanding to look at the adjacent uplands, the wetland-upland transition zone. The strategy includes specific measurable objectives to protect existing transition zone and to look for opportunities to protect and enhance undeveloped areas adjacent to the wetland edge. Task 2 of the Marshes on the Margins project was designed to support the regional strategy by defining the transition zone, mapping at a regional scale the existing transition zone from point conception to the Mexican border, identifying future transition zone for protection and restoration, and developing guidance for the management of these areas. The regional strategy is available for download along with the mapping at squirt.databasin.org. So we began by defining the transition zone. Supporting biological diversity within the transition zone includes providing enough space for wildlife refuge and predation, facilitating wildlife movement, and contributing to a landscape complexity by supporting unique transition habitats. How exactly the transition zone supports biodiversity can vary significantly by site and is influenced by elevation, slope, soils, vegetation, and land use. To roughly define a transition zone that will be broadly applicable across the region, we focused on determining widths that would likely provide enough area for key geomorphic and ecological processes. This figure shows a summary of widths over which these processes would be expected to occur, as reported in the literature. In keeping with the regional strategy's aspirational spirit, we defined an upper boundary to encourage wetland managers to look well outside the current wetland boundaries. Most of the biological processes associated with the transition zone are captured within a range of tens to hundreds of meters, as shown. To capture all these processes, the Science Advisory Panel recommended a transition zone width of 500 meters. Now, this figure shows the relative position of the transition zone in relation to the wetlands and uplands. Within the transition zone lies the marsh migration zone. This is an area that marshes can expand into unimpeded as sea level rises. The marsh migration zone is defined by elevation and was chosen by the Science Advisory Panel to represent 0.6 meters or 24 inches of sea level rise. As sea level rises and marshes migrate landward, the transition zone also moves upslope in tandem. This figure shows how these simple transition zone definitions have been applied in the regional mapping. To determine the present day transition zone, we mapped the current wetland boundary and added 500 meters from this boundary. To define the future transition zone, we mapped the mean higher water contour with an additional 0.6 meters of sea level rise, and then added 500 meters from that future boundary. However, much of the land surrounding Southern California wetlands is urban. And so we have masked these developed areas in the mapping. Although many developed areas are unlikely to be considered for potential restoration, these areas may still support transition zone functions. For example, some land uses in developed areas, such as vacant lots or golf courses, may still provide some buffering functions. Actions taken in developed areas within this boundary can support wildlife movement, such as removal of barriers and planting of native vegetation in yards. And they could also affect flood control, such as rain gardens and bioswales. This mapping was undertaken to identify transition zone at the regional scale of the Southern California Bight and to indicate where there may be opportunities at the broad scale. Here is an example of how it was applied at Goleta Slough near Santa Barbara. Here are the contemporary wetlands. The vegetated tidal wetland is shown in green, unvegetated tidal wetlands are shown in tan, and shallow subtidal is shown in dark blue, and other non-tidal wetlands disconnected by levees are shown in light blue. Here are the present and future transition zones as defined above, overlain without regard for present urban development. The yellow areas are within 500 meters of existing wetlands. The green areas are future transition zones that would become available if the sea level rose by 0.6 of a meter and the existing wetlands are allowed to migrate. Orange areas indicate transition zones adjacent to channels. Of course, this is aspirational in the extreme. The reality of urban development and the dissection of the slough by levees and berms paints a far more sober picture. If we overlay our developed layer on top, shown in gray, we see much of the remaining present and future transition zone is separated into poorly connected fragments distant from tidal wetlands. With the limited extent of tidal wetlands, the transition zone in many places is limited to adjacent diked wetlands without much natural elevation gain. In many areas, there is a need to restore tidal wetlands first to create opportunities to reconnect the wetland-upland transition zone. In our report, we identify several management strategies that could increase the area available for transition zones, as shown here. Starting in the bottom left and working anti-clockwise, a first strategy could be to remove barriers such as berms that prevent wetlands expanding or migrating. A second strategy is to protect, manage, and acquire adjacent land within the future wetland migration space. A third strategy would be to relocate or modify adjacent infrastructure or development. However, Goleta does illustrate the need for a fourth strategy in places where the floodplain has been dissected into smaller, spatially distinct units by levees, and there are significant distances separating wetlands from uplands. These traditional levees are steep and narrow and provide little transition zone. Here we might consider grading the land adjacent to wetland to increase opportunities for migration. Hopefully the 2018 regional strategy, together with this NOAA-funded guidance document and the associated regional mapping, will help see the transition zone increasingly incorporated into tidal wetland restoration. Again, these are all available at squirp.databasin.org. And with that, I'll stop sharing my screen and pass it on to Dane.
Thank you, Jeremy. Let me maximize this. Okay. Thank you, Jeremy. So my name is Dane Behrens. I'm an engineer with ESA. And I worked closely with John Largere and Sam Winter from UC Davis on this. So essentially, we were all working together to look at one of the ubiquitous pieces of this Southern California landscape, which is the mouth morphology, and how that really sets the hydrology of these coastal marsh systems, and looked at why is that important. So we also, I want to say, worked really closely with the USGS team that will be speaking in a little bit. So Karen Thorne, Kevin Buffington, and Scott Jones. And they will be talking a little bit more about how specifically the marshes will accrete with sea level rise, and how that's related to the mouth morphology. We were focused really closely on the lagoon mouth itself and how that behavior of the lagoon mouth might change with sea level rise. So, and I'll be paraphrasing some results from a few folks on our team, including Bob Battaglio and Eddie DeVita as well. So I do want to give a quick overview of some of the basics for lagoon mouth closure, just to sort of orient everybody. It's really essential to think about this process when you're looking at coastal marsh adjustment to sea level rise in California, because the mouth really sets, the mouth of these lagoons really does set the hydrology of the system, which has a very strong control on the vegetated communities. So when we talk about, when I say closure, what do I mean? I mean, essentially sand getting pushed into the mouth of the estuary lagoon by wave action. And so what are the processes that control that? So if you look at this very conceptual diagram here on the left, on the y-axis, we have going up, we have more wave exposure or larger waves. On the x-axis going to the right, we have a larger basin or a higher stream flow. So more flow coming in and out of the mouth, essentially. And just sort of generally speaking, what we tend to find is that systems that have smaller wave exposure or smaller wave action, or a very large basin or more stream flow, those tend to be open. They have a mouth that's open a lot. And the tidal marshes within those systems are often set more at elevation by the coastal water levels, the coastal tides. But you know, most of the systems in California are actually a lot drier, a lot smaller than that, and are not fully tidal all the time. So they maybe have more wave exposure and smaller basins or less stream flow. And they'll have these periods of time when their mouth is closed. And this could be a few weeks, it could be several months, it could be most of the year in some systems. And so these systems tend to be more closed or perched really high above ocean tides a lot of the time. And a lot of systems really kind of live in the middle. So they're maybe intermittently closed, but depending on the season, how dry or wet it is, they might flip to being more open or more closed. That's one piece of this. The other piece is, you know, once the lagoon is closed, when is it going to breach? And that's also really important to the hydrology and also the marsh systems behind the barrier. So this is just a schematic here from Aliso Creek, just showing, you know, once the lagoon is closed, like you see here, the hydrology sort of shifts. So you have now fresh water coming in and collecting behind the beach, and then you have lost terms like evapotranspiration and beach seepage. And essentially the question of how long does it take to breach is very closely related to how high the waves build the beach, and also what's the floodplain size. And so if you have a larger floodplain or a higher beach, it's going to take longer for water to fill up to the level where it can erode a new mouth. And this is important, especially the floodplain size component of this, because if you have a very large basin, whether you get, you know, accretion matching sea level rise or whether you don't will really affect how long these systems would stay closed. So in looking at these systems, there's a closure piece and there's also a breaching piece. And so really quickly, just wanted to cover the way that we modeled this. So we used an approach called a quantified conceptual model, or a QCM. And really essentially all that means is that we have a water balance for the lagoon that incorporates all the inflow and outflow terms, including through the mouth when it's open, and also looks at, you know, what's the water balance when it's open and when it's closed, and it toggles between the two. But that's also really tied to a sediment mass balance for the mouth. So this is either the beach or the lagoon mouth. And so this is just accounting for the fact that if you have large waves, maybe the mouth accretes and maybe it closes off. Or if you have very fast flows from, you know, a rainfall event or from large tide ranges, maybe it erodes back down. So the approach that we use is sort of a balance between a water balance in the lagoon tied to a mass balance for the lagoon mouth. And it's sort of a time series approach. So this is an example, just showing, this is stream flow in the middle and wave power on the bottom. That's a surrogate for sand getting pushed on the beach. This top plot is just showing tides. So the blue is the ocean tide, black is the predicted lagoon tide in the lagoon. And then the red dashed line is the predicted elevation of that inlet or mouth bed. And you can see here that it changes over time in response to the tide range varying. So it's a time series approach. And essentially what happens is if we go a little bit forward in time and you look at maybe an event where you get slightly higher waves, what can happen is the mouth can accrete and then eventually be higher than both the lagoon and the ocean water levels. That's when the mouth closes. So we try to simulate these events. If you go further in time, maybe you want to simulate a series of closure and breach events. And you can see at the end of this plot here, you get a very large stream flow event, and maybe that erodes the mouth, causes it to stay open for some amount of time. Essentially, all we're doing is using this time series approach, and we're using this to try to match data that's observed in each of these lagoons. And that allows us to look at sensitivity cases. So then, you know, if we can hindcast it, maybe we can say, well, what happens if the stream flow changes, or if you get 1 or 2 or 3 feet of sea level rise and so forth, just to understand what's the sensitivity of this lagoon mouth behavior over time, because that's so vital to understanding how the marshes will change, because the marshes are very closely related to the water levels in the lagoon, which in turn are related to the mouth condition. So we modeled 3 systems. I'm showing 2 here. We modeled a, excuse me, Los Peñasquitos, which is shown on the left here. This is a hindcasted water level time series from the model, with the blue being the data. On the right is the Goleta Slough. We also modeled the Tijuana River, which I've not shown here. And essentially what we've done is hindcasted conditions, try to match observed conditions in the lagoon. And then we looked forward and we said, well, what would happen if X, Y, or Z changed? And in this case, we looked at different accretion rates and also different management scenarios. So as Jeremy was discussing, you know, if you look at the broad envelope of conditions, maybe you have a case where the marsh is able to migrate upland unimpeded, which is very unrealistic. This is if you have no infrastructure. And on the other end of the envelope, maybe you have the case that's much more constrained and more realistic, which is that you have a lot of infrastructure that will not move. Maybe the reality is somewhere in between these two, but essentially we modeled both of these envelope cases to understand how those two things might affect how the lagoon mouth behavior would respond. So I'm very quickly just going to talk about some of the results related to the amount of time the lagoon would be closed in the future with sea level rise. But really the punchline of all this is going to be discussed by Kevin Buffington later. So the USGS used a lot of the outputs from this model to understand closure behavior in the future, which then they use to understand how the marshes may accrete. But I will say that looking at Los Pen, what we found is that in the future with sea level rise, that's on this x-axis, sea level rise increasing to the right, we found that the percent of the time the mouth was closed, that's on this y-axis here, went down over time. And so that's just because over time with sea level rise that we found the lagoon would tend to drown. And so with that, the amount of water sloshing in and out on any given tide became greater, and it tended to become more open over time. And that was delayed if we found there was some amount of accretion. This is all just assumed, but if we assume that there's some level of accretion, it would still close seasonally for a longer amount of time versus if it was just drowning with no accretion over time. But not all lagoons are the same. And so we found it was actually more complex when you look at other systems like Goleta. So Goleta, we found that with intermediate amounts of sea level rise, you might actually see more closure for, you know, maybe 1 or 2 feet. And that's just because if you have a large floodplain like this one, it may be possible that you're actually just holding back more water, making it take longer to breach with intermediate amounts of sea level rise, maybe because you don't have much tidal pressure to begin with. So we were finding initially closure either holds the same or maybe increases slightly, versus in the future, once you get to 2, 3, 4, 5 feet of sea level rise, as these floodplains start to flood, if accretion does not match sea level rise, we were finding that eventually it would tip the scales towards being more open over time. And the point of this is not to say that this model result is the end all and be all. We're just trying to say that the active modeling and thinking about closure is important when looking at marsh evolution in these Southern California systems. And it may not be as simple as saying that all systems will become more open immediately. It may be more complex than that for various reasons. And so really one of the important things that I wanted to point to here is that there is some level of feedback between the accretion rates in the marsh and the lagoon mouth behavior. And that was why it was really critical to interact with the USGS and others on this team to do sort of these modeling exercises in parallel. And so I think Kevin will discuss that in more detail later. And with that, I will pass it on to Maya and Lee.
Okay, hi. So thanks, Dane. My name is Lee Erickson. I'm with the USGS. And we basically used some of the results from Dane's work into our modeling. And then after that, the USGS folks of Kevin and Karen will talk further about the details to bring back on what Dane was talking about. So here, what we're did was we used Cosmos, our coastal storm modeling system, which we've already developed for the whole coastal sections of California, to look at the flow dynamics, to visualize and understand the flow dynamics within the tidal systems when they are open versus closed. So I'm going to just give a few slides overview of the modeling efforts, the numerical modeling efforts, and then Maya Hayden will talk about how we put those results into the Open Coast OCOF viewer. And the project team here, we just have a few people that were listed here. There's a bunch of people that are involved, but Babak and Jenny are key elements in the numerical modeling, and then Doug Moody, Brad, Martin, and Michael are with the Point Blue team to help with the visualizations. And next slide, please. So I'm showing here is one of the sample sites that we were working at, Los Peñasquitos in Southern California. On the left-hand side, you see an image of the digital elevation model that we use. It's a high-resolution 2-meter digital elevation model, the latest and greatest at the time. The little dots that you hopefully can see are meant to display the model grid point. So we compute flow dynamics at every single grid point. And the inlet you can see on the left-hand side is shown with a little arrow. That's the only part, exactly, thank you. And that little part right there is that we changed for an open scenario versus a closed scenario. The plot on the bottom right-hand side is a cross-section of that inlet, and the 0 sea level rise elevation there, that's the at 2.8 meters above NAV D88, that's the Fallweg elevation for a closed scenario. So that's the information we got from Dane and his group. And then for each sea level rise scenario that we simulate, we raise that Fallweg to simulate the closed condition. As you can see, we simulated individual sea level rise scenarios, 50 centimeters, 100, 150, and 200. And we also applied upon that different future storm scenarios for both the open and the closed scenarios. And an important point is that we assumed these inlets to be non-erodible, but overwash was allowed, and that does occur sometimes when we have the 100-year storm, 20, and even the annual storm. Next slide, please. This is a 3D view, you could say, of the actual grid. And what we did for this study here is we took our existing grids, but cut out only the section that's of interest to reduce computation time. So the orange part that you see is what we simulated for this particular project. And we applied boundary conditions where the arrows are pointing. And the yellow grid is the grid that we use for our Cosmos modeling system, which goes from a global to local scale to get to those boundary conditions. And in summary, we simulated 3 future storms and the no storm condition, as I'm listing here on the left-hand side. So that's 4 different scenarios. And those include time varying tides, waves, and storm surge. We combine that with 6 different sea level rise scenarios. So we run those dynamically with the 0, half meter, 1, 1.5, 2, and 5 meter sea level rise scenarios. And on top of that, for an open and a closed condition. So for a total of 48 scenarios. The bottom time series figure there shows the fluvial discharge that was input into this particular system here. So the fluvial discharges are changed with the storm event as well. So the no storm annual 20 and 100-year event flow time series are shown there. The next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the boundary conditions that we apply to that small detailed model, in this case of Los Peñasquitos, comes from larger scale modeling where we start actually at the global scale. So I'm going from the left-hand side to the right-hand side. On the global side, on the global scale, we actually simulate waves throughout the whole Pacific Basin because they generate far offshore and propagate to our coasts along California. We take those values and apply that at a regional scale, and at that point in time also apply winds and sea level pressures to generate storm surge as well as astronomic tides. We then bring that into that local scale that I just talked about, and those are then the boundary conditions. Those simulations are done for each of those scenarios that I mentioned, and then we take those results and summarize those and put them in the public web-based tools for data visualization and analysis, and that's where the OCOF comes in, our CoStar Future. And I got one more little slide just to help bring home the point that it is a dynamic system. So we are simulating upon each grid cell point the flows that are coming in and out of that inlet. And we've got fluvial discharge at the point, at the upper point in this case of the grid cell, for an open inlet on the left-hand side and a closed inlet on the right-hand side. And so from each of these simulations, we take the maximum water levels and currents, and we bring those into OCOF for viewing. And this is where Maya will take over and show a little live demo of that.
Thanks, Lee. All right, so as Lee said, we take the products and serve them up in this public web platform called our CoStar Future. And as many of you probably know, the tool was developed to support coastal decision makers in understanding vulnerabilities to sea level rise, coastal storms, erosion hazards, and most recently, rising groundwater tables. And there's more details on the standard Cosmos output product information and what hazard information is available on the science and modeling page. And we'll take a quick tour of how we've integrated the Martians on the margins, additional scenarios into the existing hazard map. So when you land, the first thing that it defaults basically to the standard statewide Cosmos products. But here and on the, so all of the control panels are on the left-hand side. You've got your legend on the right-hand side. And if you select the region to be, for example, this Los Peñasquitos Lagoon, it will zoom into that particular location. And as Lee mentioned, there are 3 products that have come out of these additional scenarios that the USGS team has run. Flooding, wave heights, and current velocities are all available. In addition, then you can look at those combination of sea level rise and storm events. And then the main addition in the scenarios is whether the mouth is open or closed. And so you can basically view all of the different combinations of scenarios and storm frequencies as well as the mouth open and mouth closed. And then the main results really, and eventually we will have all 3 of the study site locations. So Los Peñasquitos Lagoon, Goleta Slough, and the Tijuana River Estuary. The results for flooding really depend on that balance, as Dane mentioned, of fluvial inputs versus the tidal prism. And so as sea level rise increases, you're getting more and more tidal prism influence. And so actually then the higher sea level rise, it matters more whether that mouth is open or closed on the results of flooding. So the other piece I just wanted to point out is there's a scenario comparison tool here. So you can look at side by side, 2 different scenarios side by side with 2 different control panels that pop up. And you just drag the screen back and forth to view those. In addition, we've got some additional layers so you can look at buildings or transportation information just overlaid on top of that. So you can get a sense of potential assets that might be of interest or at risk. And we also have natural assets as well. And the last thing I just wanted to point it out, if you click on this little question mark, you can learn more about the details of the project. We have a link to a page about the Marshes on the Margins project, the additional Cosmos scenarios that were run, and a link to that Adaptation site where there are additional products that were talked about previously. And with that, I'm going to just quickly go back here. So please reach out if you have any questions. There's mine and Lee's contact information, as well as the links that Jen will share later. And with that, I will pass it over to Kevin and Karen. Kevin, you're muted.
How did I click that? All right. You can see all that. I'm Kevin Buffington with the USGS Western Ecological Research Center. I'll be presenting on our efforts to model future marsh evolution with sea level rise for intermittent lagoons across Southern California. Worked especially closely with Dane, John, and Sam in developing these projections. All right, so our goal was to conduct this scenario modeling for marshes to help inform management of intertidal intermittent lagoons. We wanted to explore how mouth closure, accretion processes interact to shape the resilience of marshes under sea level rise. Our objectives were to develop and calibrate a model using site-specific information, integrate QCM with warmer, and develop projections for sea level rise, marsh migration, and mouth management. First, a really quick refresher on marsh processes. Tidal marsh vegetation typically extends between mean tide level and mean high or high water. But in intermittent estuaries, marsh vegetation can be perched well above mean high water. Marshes can keep pace with sea level rise through accretion. And sediment is a particularly important component of accretion, especially in these intermittent estuaries. Prior to the site-specific modeling that we conducted, we did a meta-analysis of wetland elevations across Central and Southern California. We found that estuaries that close intermittently do have marshes that have significantly higher elevation. High sediment loads that are possible during flood events can deposit a lot of sediment on the marsh, but the sediment can only be deposited if the marsh is flooded, which usually requires the mouth of the lagoon to be closed or restricted. All right, so we developed site-specific models for 3 estuaries, Goleta, Los Pen, and Tijuana. Due to time constraints, I'm just going to focus on these 2, Goleta and Los Pen. Now, to develop projections, we used a modified version of the Warmer modeling framework. Warmer is a soil cohort model for tidal wetlands that captures the dominant above and below ground processes responsible for marsh accretion. Warmer is a 0-dimensional model, meaning that it doesn't consider its position relative to channels or the lagoon mouth, but rather assumes that elevation is the primary driver of accretion. To adapt Warmer for these systems, we integrated the daily closure probabilities from QCM that accounted for sea level rise, marsh accretion, and tidal prism. We tracked hourly water levels within the lagoon using a simple water balance model, and incorporated a model of daily rainfall and freshwater discharge based on recent historic data sets. We ran projections under 3 nonlinear sea level rise scenarios, which amounted to 36, 94, and 162 centimeters by 2100. In combination with sea level rise, we also explored 2 scenarios of mouth closure. The open scenario treats the estuary like closure doesn't occur at all. Given the other assumptions in the model, this scenario is pretty similar to current lagoon mouth management at many estuaries, with mechanical breaching occurring well before a storm might breach it naturally. The dynamic scenario uses the QCM results to model closure dynamics with sea level rise incorporated. All right, so first here's a map of the modeling domain at Los Pen, which includes all the tidal marsh, adjacent riparian wetlands, and upland habitats. We were fortunate to be able to leverage a lot of great data from the TJ NER, including elevation, bed surveys, and water quality data. All right, so we explored how marsh evolution might change under 2 marsh migration scenarios. So in the first scenario, no protection of human infrastructure, the marsh is allowed to migrate across the entire model domain. In the second scenario, existing infrastructure is protected. And so really at Los Pen, that is just these relatively small areas, parking lot and some upland areas that are inhabited by people. Okay, so here are some results for Los Pen. This figure compares total marsh area across the 12 scenarios for the 80-year simulation. Now, the first thing to note is there's really very little difference between the protection and no protection scenarios. This is because those protected areas are relatively high in elevation and not really at risk of inundation from sea level rise. So we're just going to focus on the no protection results. So the colors represent the 3 sea level rise scenarios, low sea level rise in red, moderate sea level rise in green, and high sea level rise in blue. We see that future marsh area on the y-axis is really dependent on the sea level rise scenario. The dynamic mouth scenario is the solid line, and the open is the dashed line. We see that across sea level rise scenarios, there's the dynamic scenario produces more resilience to sea level rise, especially in the near term. However, as sea level rise increases and the tidal prism changes, closure is less likely to occur. And so we see a convergence on the marsh area projections with increasing sea level rise. All right, I'll show you some maps now. What this looks like spatially. We see that, okay, so let's see, blue is open water, shallow water habitats. Greens are marsh, yellow is transitional habitat, and red is upland. We see by 2050, the marsh is starting to migrate upslope, especially under higher sea level rise. We have some conversion to open water habitat. By 2070, there's further upslope migration. And let's see, and under by the end of the century, we have really broad transition to open water habitats, although some upslope migration is able to occur under low sea level rise. Now, given the steep topography that surrounds Los Pen, there's just not a lot of space for upland migration. All right, quick conclusions here. We found that maintaining the open lagoon mouth would likely increase the rate of habitat transitions across the sea level rise scenarios. There was little difference in model projections of marsh area between the protection and no protection scenarios. Under low sea level rise, mouth management plays a much bigger role in the projections of marsh area. However, under mid and high sea level rise, does pose a threat to marshes by the end of the century, regardless of mouth management, due to the lack of migration space. Okay, so switching now to Goleta Slough, this is a map of the domain that we modeled. Again, we ran 2 kind of marsh migration projections. First one allowing marsh to go anywhere in the domain, and the second one really protecting existing infrastructure, the big one being the Santa Barbara Airport there. All right, so unlike Los Pen, at Goleta, there were very large differences between the marsh migration scenarios, but little difference in the mouth management scenarios. Under the no protection scenario, we see that there's potentially a lot of space for marsh migration, especially under high sea level rise. However, without that migration space, we have the airport and the other developments, marsh loss was projected to occur around 2060 under the high sea level rise and about 2075 under the moderate sea level rise scenario. All right, again, I'll show you some maps of this. Under mid and high sea level rise, the existing marsh begins to transition primarily to low marsh habitat by 2050. By 2070, upslope migration begins under the mid and high scenarios. By the end of the century, the area surrounding the airport is well on its way to becoming a beautiful tidal wetland. All right, so now I'll show you the alternative, where we assume that all existing infrastructure is protected from sea level rise. By 2050, low marsh area is definitely increasing in abundance under the higher scenarios. By 2070, existing marsh area is starting to convert to open water. And by 2100, the domain is covered primarily by either low marsh or has converted to open water. There are some areas certainly that look primed for upslope migration, but pretty limited. All right, so in conclusion for Goleta, there were large differences in model projections of between the protection and no protection scenarios. Marsh loss was projected in all except the no protection high sea level rise scenario. And future marsh extent really depends on decisions regarding protection of infrastructure. All right, so final take homes. We found that mouth management was an important factor for near-term resilience to sea level rise, at least at Los Peñasquitos. Allowing the mouth to remain closed can trap sediment and may increase accretion rates. However, as the rate of sea level rise increases later this century, areas for upslope migration are really critical to maintain marsh habitat. A manuscript describing these results is in preparation. This modeling approach is generally applicable or transferable to other lagoons, though we would need some additional QCM results to make similar products. And these models could be rerun as new information becomes available. Of particular need is more data on the range of accretion rates that can occur due to flooding when the mouth is closed or restricted. With that, I'll pass it back to Jen, who will moderate any questions. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you so much to the panelists. As questions come in, Evan is going to briefly share her screen to show one more demo.
Yeah. Hopefully I don't get frozen. If I do, carry on with questions and I'll hop back on. I wanted to show you the Adaptation tool where you can find all of the transition zone maps and a lot of other cool stuff. So here's the WRP databasin.org. There's lots of different reports and information, but if you click this Explore Wetlands map icon, a tab pops up and you can zoom in to your favorite wetland and look at a ton of layers that were developed during the regional strategy process. So if I want to go pick my favorite wetland, you can see on the left, it says WRP and there's a series of layers. The contemporary wetlands of 2019 is the habitats I'm showing right now at Buena Vista Lagoon. I actually didn't want Buena Vista. Let me zoom out. I want to pick a site that I know will have data for you. That would be down here at San Alejo. Where's San Alejo? Right here. Okay, so contemporary wetlands. Here we see vegetated marsh, unvegetated marsh, and open water. And then the transition zone maps are down here, transition zone buffers 2019 and riverine transition zones. So if you click transition zone buffers, you'll see that we have the present day transition zones in yellow and no future ones. And these were the maps that Jeremy was sharing. But for all 104 estuaries across the Bight, you can go zoom into a wetland and look at these transition zones and maps of habitats. So here's the riverine transition zones. So these are potential transition zones adjacent to channels. We also have a historical habitat, so you can see what these wetlands looked like in the 1800s and lots of other information. So I just wanted to share that because it's a really cool tool that many people don't know about yet. And I will stop sharing.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that, Evan. That puts it into a lot of context. It's really cool science all of you have done. So really appreciate you all coming on to share. Remember, folks, to put questions in the Q&A, at least this one. says, our CoStar Future is a really good tool to see how sea level rise inundation scenarios in the future. Was wondering if there is an online tool USGS recommends for marsh migration modeling for 2050 and 2100, based on Kevin's last presentation.
Yeah, unfortunately, there isn't. We don't have a platform or a way to present those or host those online. We will be releasing all the data, in conjunction with the manuscript science base, but unfortunately, yeah, we don't have support to put those online. It'd be great to. Totally agree. It'd be an awesome way to interact with the data.
Yeah, it was a goal of the project to try to get it on OCOF, but there was a variety of issues that made it impossible.
All right. Well, maybe we have time for like one more question, but I have one myself. So with this approach, Kevin, you mentioned that it could be applied to other marsh habitats. Could these modeling systems also be used for different coastal habitats? Like, at least back in my research, I did rocking or tidal, but different marsh or wetland habitats.
Yeah, in general, the approach is fairly flexible and could be applied in the habitat response to inundation in the future and such. Then I think we could work to develop similar projections.
Awesome. Thanks for answering that. I not seen any other questions in the Q&A, but yeah, thank you very much for the great presentations from an anonymous attendee. Yes, thank you very much for covering all the amazing work that you've done in such a collaborative way. I wanted to double check if it would be okay if I put your contact information in the follow-up email in case folks want to reach out individually on the presentations. I'm seeing general nods for that. And Lee, I'm going, go ahead.
Sorry. I was trying to give a thumbs up. Yes, you can share the information.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, and with that, that is all the time we have for today. So I just want to thank our panelists again for presenting the Marshes on the Margin project. It really seemed like a really collaborative effort and really honored that the Coastal Resilience Network could highlight it. And thank you all for the attendees that listened in today. I hope everyone learned something new. I learned everything new today, so really appreciate that. And slides and recording will be available as soon as possible. And I hope everyone has a great rest of their week and take care.
All right. Thanks, Jen. Bye. Bye, everyone.